I didn't plan on going to war with a neighborhood, especially not one that didn't even exist a year ago. But the moment I saw that pipe pointed straight at my land, I knew somebody had made a decision that was going to cost them more than they thought. And yeah, I'll admit it, I'm the one who made sure it did. It all started with rain, the kind that doesn't just fall. It lingers, hangs in the air, seeps into everything, a full week of it, steady and patient, like it had nowhere else to be. Now I've lived on that piece of land outside Millbrook, Georgia for almost 20 years, and that lower pasture of mine, it's always been the lowest point around, sure, but it handled water just fine, clay-heavy soil, slight grade. Old drainage paths cut in naturally over time. Nothing fancy, but it worked. My horses grazed there every morning, grass thick enough to swallow your boots if you stood still too long. It was the kind of land that didn't complain, didn't ask for much, just needed a little sun after the rain, and it bounced right back. Except this time, it didn't. I remember walking out that morning, coffee still warm in my hand, expecting mud, maybe a few puddles, but what I saw, it stopped me cold. The whole pasture looked like it had been turned into a shallow swamp overnight. Water sitting still, not draining, just collecting, thick, murky, with this oily sheen floating on top like something didn't belong there. Bits of trash too, wrappers, plastic, even what looked like insulation foam drifting near the fence line, and the smell, not just wet earth, but something sour, chemical almost. My horses were standing off to the side, uneasy, not touching the grass, and that's when my stomach dropped, because animals know, they always know when something's off. I walked further in, boots sinking deeper than they ever had before, and I could feel it wasn't just rainwater. This was runoff, heavy, forced, like it had been dumped all at once. And then I saw how close it was getting to the barn. Just a few more inches, and it would start seeping under the side panels. Now that barn isn't just wood and nails, it's years of work, repairs, memories. You don't just let water creep into something like that. So yeah, I didn't wait. I set the mug down right there on the fence post, grabbed my coat, and started walking the perimeter. Now, when you live out here long enough, you get to know every inch of your boundary, every tree that leans a little too far, every section of fence that needs tightening, every dip in the ground where water likes to gather. And as I made my way toward the northern edge, where my land meets that new development, that's when I saw it, clean, sharp, and completely out of place, the concrete. Retaining wall, freshly poured, cutting across what used to be a line of old pines, and right through the base of it, a storm drain pipe, wide enough to crawl through, sticking out like it had every right in the world to be there. And I swear, for a second, I just stood there staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was looking at, because that pipe, it wasn't there 2 weeks ago. Hell, it wasn't there 3 days ago, and the ground around it was still raw, red clay packed down by heavy equipment tracks. I stepped closer, boots squelching, and that's when I heard it, not loud, but steady, water moving through that pipe, pouring out into my pasture in a constant stream. Not a trickle, not natural runoff. This was directed, controlled, engineered, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The swamp, the debris, the smell. It wasn't the rain, it was them, the folks building that subdivision up on the ridge, brand new homes, manicured lawns, little flags out front like they were selling a dream. I'd seen the signs go up months back, Cedar Ridge Estates, something like that, didn't think much of it at the time. Figured it was just another development trying to turn farmland into cul-de-sacs. Happens all the time. But what I didn't expect was for them to decide that my land was going to be their drainage solution. I followed the line of that pipe back with my eyes, up toward their side, and I could see it now, a retention pond, freshly dug, sitting just behind their first row of houses, water level high from the storm, pushing right up to the edge, and instead of holding it, instead of managing it like they're supposed to, they punched a hole through that wall and sent it straight downhill, straight into my pasture. No warning, no conversation, no easement agreement, nothing, just decided, and I remember feeling this mix of disbelief and something sharper, something that settles in your chest and doesn't go away easy. Because this wasn't an accident, this was a choice. Somebody signed off on that pipe. Somebody looked at a map, saw my land sitting lower, and thought, yeah, that'll do. And I'll be honest, part of me wanted to believe there had to be some mistake, some miscommunication. So I pulled out my phone right there, mud on my hands and all, and I called the number listed on the development sign. It rang a few times before a guy picked up, calm voice, professional, introduced himself as Trevor Blake, property manager for the Cedar Ridge HOA, and I told him what I was seeing, kept it measured, gave him the benefit of the doubt, but the way he responded, it wasn't confusion, it wasn't concern, it was casual, almost rehearsed. He said, "Well, yeah, the water's got to go somewhere, sir. Your land is the natural low point in that area. It's just standard drainage." And that right there, that was the moment something shifted, because there's a difference between water finding its way and someone deciding where it's allowed to go and standing there, boots buried in water that didn't belong on my land. Listening to a man tell me this was standard. I realized I wasn't dealing with a mistake. I was dealing with people who thought they could get away with it. And I hadn't even started pushing back yet. If you want, I'll keep going into what I did next, because that's where things really started to change. The thing about that kind of answer, the calm, almost bored way Trevor said it, like he'd had that conversation before and already knew how it ended, it sticks with you. I stood there a few seconds after the call dropped, just listening to the water pouring out of that pipe, steady as a heartbeat, and I remember thinking, all right, if that's how they're playing this, then I need to be real clear about what comes next. But I didn't jump straight into anything drastic, not yet. I've lived long enough to know you give people a chance to fix their own mess before you make them regret not doing it. So I cleaned up, changed boots, and drove up to the entrance of Cedar Ridge Estates. And I'll tell you, the contrast was almost insulting. Fresh asphalt, trimmed hedges, those identical mailboxes lined up like soldiers, and right behind it all, that retention pond, sitting high and full, like a glass about to spill. I parked near the temporary sales office, one of those prefab trailers dressed up to look welcoming, and inside it smelled like new carpet and coffee pods. There was a young woman at the desk, polite, a little nervous when I introduced myself, probably because I still had dried mud on my jeans. I asked for Trevor. She hesitated, then pointed me toward a back office, and when I stepped in, there he was, exactly like his voice sounded, mid-40s, pressed shirt, not a speck of dirt on him, sitting behind a desk like the world outside didn't apply. He gave me a quick smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, and said, "Mr. Lawson, right? I figured you might stop by." I didn't sit. I just told him straight, "You've got a pipe draining into my pasture, and it's flooding my barn." And he leaned back slightly, folded his hands like this was a routine meeting, and said, "We've already discussed that it's compliant with the grading plan." I remember letting out a short laugh, not because anything was funny, but because I needed a second to keep my temper in check. "Compliant with what?" I asked. "Because it sure as hell isn't compliant with my permission." And that's when his tone shifted, just a notch, still polite, but colder. "Look," he said, "the county approved our drainage design. The topography dictates flow. We didn't create gravity." I stepped closer to his desk, put both hands on it, leaned in just enough to make sure he understood I wasn't playing. "Gravity didn't pour a concrete pipe through your wall," I said. "You did." There was a pause, not long, but enough, and then he gave that little shrug, like he was done entertaining the conversation. "If you have a problem, you're welcome to file a complaint with the county," he said. "That's the process." And there it was, the process, the word people use when they know time is on their side. I straightened up, nodded once, and said, "All right, I will." And I walked out before I said something I couldn't take back. Now, the county office wasn't far, maybe 15 minutes down the road, and I drove there with that same steady feeling building in my chest. Not anger exactly, something more focused, like I could already see where this was going inside. It was the usual, fluorescent lights, paperwork stacked in trays, a woman behind the counter who looked like she'd been dealing with complaints longer than I'd owned my land. I explained the situation, showed her the photos I'd taken, the pipe, the flooding, the debris. She nodded, typed a few things into her computer, printed out a form. "We'll open a case," she said. "An inspector will review it. Timeline's about 4 to 6 weeks." I just stared at her for a second. 4 to 6 weeks? She gave me that sympathetic look, the one that doesn't actually change anything. "We're a little backed up right now." And I remember thinking about my pasture, about that water creeping closer to the barn, about my horses standing off to the side because they wouldn't touch what was left of the grass, and I realized something in that moment. Nobody was coming to fix this in time. Not Trevor, not the county, nobody but me. I drove home slower than I had earlier, windows down, letting the air clear my head, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, the plan had already started forming, not all at once, but piece by piece. I walked back out to the fence line, stood there again looking at that pipe, at the way the water pushed through it like it owned the place, and I said it out loud, even though no one was there to hear it. All right, you want my land to solve your problem? Let's see how you handle it when it doesn't. That evening, I called my neighbor, Walt. He's the kind of guy who doesn't ask too many questions if you sound like you've already made up your mind, runs a small excavation business, keeps a backhoe parked behind his barn like it's an extra limb. I told him I needed help moving some dirt, building up a berm along my fence line. He paused for a second, then said, "This about that new development?" I said, "Yeah." Another pause, then a low chuckle. "All right, I'll bring the machine in the morning." Next day, we got to work. I'd already had 4 truckloads of heavy clay fill delivered before sunrise, stacked in a long mound near the north edge, the kind of soil that doesn't let water pass easy. We started shaping it into a raised berm, about 2 feet high, running parallel to the fence, but still clearly on my side. I made sure of that. Every inch of what we did stayed within my property line. Walt worked the backhoe with that slow, deliberate precision you only get from years of doing the same thing. Scoop, lift, pack it down, again and again until it started to look less like a pile of dirt and more like a wall. We didn't rush, took most of the day, sun breaking through the clouds for the first time all week, steam rising off the wet ground. And as that berm took shape, I could already see the change. The water that had been spreading toward the barn now hitting that barrier. Slowing, redirecting, but I wasn't done. Not even close. Because that pipe, that was the real issue. Late afternoon, I went into town, picked up a thick roll of industrial plastic liner, the kind used for ponds, and a stack of cinder blocks. When I got back, Walt raised an eyebrow, like he was starting to see where this was heading. "You sure about this?" he asked. I looked at the pipe, water still pouring out, steady as ever. "Yeah," I said, "I'm sure." We waited until the flow eased just a bit, enough for us to work without getting knocked back. Then I laid that plastic over the mouth of the pipe, pressed it tight against the opening, and one by one, we stacked the cinder blocks in a tight half circle, sealing it off, reinforcing it so it wouldn't just give way under pressure. It wasn't pretty, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to hold. By the time we stepped back, mud up to our knees, hands filthy, that pipe was done. No more water coming through, just a dull, muffled pressure behind it. Walt wiped his hands on his jeans, looked at me, and said, "Well, guess they're about to notice." I gave a small nod, eyes still on that wall of blocks. "Yeah," I said, "they will." And for the first time since this whole thing started, I felt something close to calm. Not because it was over, but because whatever happened next wasn't going to be on me. If you want, I'll tell you what happened when the next storm hit, because that's when everything really came to a head. That silence didn't last long. It never does when people realize the ground under them isn't as solid as they thought. Trevor was the first to recover, straightening his shoulders, smoothing out his tone like he could still steer this back into something controlled. "We followed approved plans," he said, glancing briefly at the woman with the folder like he needed confirmation. "Everything was submitted, everything was reviewed." I didn't argue with him. Not right away, because I'd heard that kind of confidence before. The kind that leans on paperwork without really understanding what that paperwork actually allows. Instead, I just nodded once and said, "Then you won't have any problem when the county takes a look at it." And that's when the edge came back into his voice. "We don't need the county involved in this," he said, quick, almost reflexive, and there it was again, that little crack. Because people who are sure they're in the clear don't try to keep inspectors away. I let that hang between us for a second, then stepped past them, heading toward the fence line. "You're welcome to come see it," I said over my shoulder. "Just don't cross onto my property without asking." They followed anyway, stopping just short of the fence, shoes already picking up mud they clearly weren't used to, and when they saw the berm up close, the way it ran clean and deliberate along my side, and then the pipe, sealed tight, reinforced, unmoving, you could feel the shift. This wasn't some temporary fix they could just kick apart. This was intentional, thought through, and completely within my boundary. The woman with the folder flipped it open, scanning papers, lips pressed tight. One of the other men pulled out his phone. Taking pictures like that might somehow undo what he was seeing. Trevor just stood there, staring at the pipe, jaw set. "This is going to cost you," he said finally, not loud, but heavy, and I shrugged slightly. "It already has," I replied. "Just not me." They left not long after that. No handshake, no resolution. Just engines starting up and tires spinning a little too fast as they pulled back onto the road. And for a few hours, things went quiet again. The kind of quiet that feels like the air is holding its breath. Then, right around noon, a county truck rolled up. Older model, dust on the sides, the kind of vehicle that's seen more back roads than pavement. Out stepped a man named Carl Henderson, inspector badge clipped too. His belt, hat pulled low against the sun that had finally decided to show up. He introduced himself. Firm handshake. Eyes already scanning the land like he was piecing things together before anyone said a word. "Got a complaint about drainage," he said. "Figured I'd come take a look sooner rather than later." I appreciated that, didn't say it outright, but I think he could tell. I walked him down to the fence line, explained what I'd seen, when it started, showed him the photos on my phone from before I blocked the pipe, the water, the debris, how close it got to the barn. He didn't interrupt much, just nodded here and there, crouched down near the berm, pressed his boot into the soil, then stepped over to the pipe, or what used to be the outlet. He ran a hand along the concrete edge where it came through the retaining wall, frowned slightly. "You didn't install this, right?" he asked. "No," I said. "That came from their side." He stood up, looked past the wall toward the subdivision, then back at me. "You got any paperwork from them? Easement, agreement, anything like that?" I shook my head. "Nothing." He let out a slow breath, the kind that says he's already forming an opinion. "All right," he said. "Let's go have a conversation with your neighbors." We drove over together this time, my truck following behind his. And when we pulled into Cedar Ridge, it didn't look like the same place I'd seen the night before. Not exactly. The water had receded some, but the marks were there, muddy lines along the sides of houses, debris caught in bushes, sections of lawn torn up where water had rushed through too fast, and there, near the pond, a couple of portable pumps already set up, hoses snaking across the ground, churning water back out toward the street. Trevor was waiting for us. I'll give him that. He didn't hide, stepped forward as Carl got UT of the truck, expression tight but composed, introductions were short, no small talk. Carl got straight to it. "Mind showing me your drainage system?" Trevor hesitated just a fraction of a second, then nodded. Of course. They walked the perimeter of the pond, Trevor pointing things out, using words like capacity and flow rate and design compliance. And Carl listened, really listened, asked a few questions, took a few notes. Then he stopped at the retaining wall, right where that pipe pushed through. He crouched down, looked at the edges, the way it had been set into the concrete. And then he stood up, turned to Trevor, and asked one simple question. "Where's the permit for this outlet?" And I swear, you could feel the air change right there. Trevor opened his mouth, closed it, glanced back toward the sales office like the answer might be sitting on a desk somewhere. "It's part of the overall drainage plan," he said finally, and Carl shook his head, slow. "That's not what I asked. This structure," he tapped the concrete lightly with his boot. "This discharge point. Where's the permit?" The silence that followed was a different kind this time. Heavier, because now it wasn't just me standing on one side of a fence. Now, it was someone with authority asking a question that actually mattered. The woman with the folder stepped in, flipping through pages faster now, but whatever she was looking for, it wasn't there. Carl nodded once, like he'd expected that. "All right," he said. "Here's what's going to happen. This outlet's not permitted, and it's directing runoff onto adjacent private property without an easement. That's a violation." He let that sink in, then continued. "You're going to need to cease use immediately and implement a compliant drainage solution contained within your development boundaries." Trevor tried to push back. Of course he did, talked about timelines, about costs, about how this would affect homeowners, and Carl listened for about 10 seconds before holding up a hand. "I understand it's inconvenient," he said, "but that doesn't make it legal." And just like that, it was done. Not in some dramatic, shouting match kind of way, but in that quiet, final tone that doesn't leave room for argument. Over the next few weeks, I watched it unfold from a distance, trucks coming in, crews digging, rerouting their entire system, installing new underground piping to carry water where it was supposed to go in the first place, pumps running day and night at first, trying to keep things from backing up again. I heard numbers through the grapevine. Near 6 figures by the time it was all said and done. Maybe more if you counted repairs to those flooded basements. And through it all, nobody came back to my door. No apology, no acknowledgement, just distance. Like if they didn't look at me, they wouldn't have to think about how it got to that point. And honestly, I was fine with that, because back on my side of the fence, things settled, the pasture dried out, grass slowly came back in patches, then thicker, stronger. My horses went back to grazing like nothing had ever happened, which is about the best kind of ending you can hope for out here. The barn stayed solid, no water damage, no lingering issues, just normal again. But every now and then, when I drive past the entrance to Cedar Ridge, I still notice things, small stuff, cracks along the edge of that tennis court they were so proud of, spots where the asphalt dips just a little from where water sat too long. And I think about how all of it, every bit of it, started with a decision that probably felt small at the time. Just send the water downhill. Let someone else deal with it. Standard practice, that's what he called it. And maybe in some places, people let that slide. Maybe they file the complaint, wait the weeks, hope it works out. But I guess I'm not built that way. I believe if something's yours, the problem, the responsibility, the consequences, then it ought to stay yours. And if you try to push it on to someone else, well, you better be ready for what happens when they push back. So I'll ask you this, honestly. If you were standing where I was, watching your land drown because someone decided it was convenient, would you have blocked that pipe? Or would you have waited for the process to catch up? Go ahead and tell me what you think, because I've heard both sides. And yeah, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more stories like this.